time here, so thought I'd do another video. I had this topic on my mind throughout the day. So let's talk about um, becoming an owner operator. The Navy SEALs has a saying that the only easy day was yesterday. And I think that would serve a lot of owner operators, a lot of prospective owner operators, those company drivers who think about becoming owner operators, to adopt that slogan. The only easy day was yesterday, because being an owner operator is not easy. It is hard work. And, if you think it's easy money, then, you're in for a rude surprise. If it was easy, everybody would do it. If it was not challenging, then it wouldn't be any fun either. So is it hard? Yeah, at times it's very hard. It's very hard. It'll take all your knowledge, all your skills, all your ability, all your money, all your time to run a small business. And if you're not ready for that kind of commitment, then you should think twice about becoming an owner operator. Because there's guys who's tried becoming an owner operator, and then they decide to go back to being a company driver. And I would say, if you're gonna if you're gonna change your mind, do it early. Because the owner operator business model is about commitment. You have to commit to running a small business. You have to commit to that truck. And you can't give up. That's the thing. Is like, this business will chew you up very easily. And and hear guys tell their stories that they try being an owner operator and they decide to become a company driver. You ever hear that saying, once bitten, twice shy? And they will never try to become an owner operator again, because they tried it once and it didn't work out. And why didn't it work out? Well, it's probably because in those older trucks, those Cascadia 125 models, they did not come with a warranty. And a lot of guys would be faced with enormous repair bills. A one box would be anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000, and that could wipe you out as a small business owner. That right there take out all your money. It just wiped you out. And then it's like, look, I can't afford these truck repairs. And then they start doing the math. They're like, they figure out they would be better off being a company driver. Or maybe they can afford it, but then it's like, look, I don't want the headache, because you never really have a day off as an owner operator. Because if you're not driving, you're probably doing maintenance. And if you're not doing maintenance, you're probably doing accounting or finances or purchasing or research. So there's never really a day off when you're running a small business. They say trucking is my life. Well, when you're a small business owner, it is your life. It's your baby. So you have to really commit to it. And some people aren't necessarily prepared for that level of commitment. They think being an owner operator is going to be great, and then they realize what it takes, and they're like, no thanks, I don't want nothing to do with it. That happens. But there are advantages that, like, company drivers have that owner operators do not have, and a lot of it has to do with the 401k match and the profit sharing plan, which owner operators we don't get. So typically how it works with the 401k, they have what's called a vesting schedule, and that is, the company puts in a certain percentage match into your 401k, but you don't get to keep that money unless you stay with the company so many years until you're 100% vested. So, each year you're with the company, you're a little more invested than you were the previous year. And this is kind of like golden handcuffs. This is a retention tool that the companies use to reduce turnover. And even if you were a company driver and you're you're thinking, I want to become an owner operator, then you look at your 401k and the vesting schedule, and you realize that if you make the change, you could lose money from that company match program because you're not fully 100% vested. Similarly is the company profit sharing plan. And they could have a formula that rewards years of service. And as you become a senior driver and you're making the top rate per mile plus 401k match plus profit sharing, and if you become an owner operator, you lose all that. You lose all your years of service for profit sharing. So because you're no longer an employee, you're not eligible for profit sharing. So even if they were a really solid company driver and they were thinking about becoming an owner operator, from a retirement standpoint, they're looking at that profit sharing, they're looking at that 401k, and they're like, I can't do it. I can't walk away from my retirement money. So that's how companies can tie you up a little bit in those programs. So let's say, for example, you're interested in becoming an owner operator. I think you got to do it early. You got to do it, probably make up your decision whether or not you want to become an owner operator within the first two, 2, 3, 4 years of driving. Because once you get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of driving, you're into those retirement plans, and you can't easily transition into becoming an owner operator. So let's say, okay, you've been 2 years driving, you decide to buy a truck, and now you're going to become an owner operator, and it's like you thought you wanted to become an owner operator, but then now you're going to change your mind, but go back to being a company driver. You should probably change your mind early, because you get into those company retirement plans, they reward years of service. So if you spend 10 years as an owner operator and then decide you want to become a company driver, you don't get those 10 years of service, even if you were leased on with that carrier, because you're not an employee, you're not eligible. You have no legal eligibility for those plans. So it's one of these situations where you're going to become an owner operator, you're probably better off staying as an owner operator rather than switching back and forth, because you're not going to benefit, you know, going back to being a company driver, because you won't get any credit for the years of service, even if you were leased on with that company. So from a dollar standpoint, you'd be better off staying as a owner operator. You're committed to that career path as an owner operator. That's why I say, once an owner operator, always an owner operator, unless you change your mind after the first year or second year and decide, oh, I'm better off as a company driver. It's tough, because the company rewards their employees that stay with them. That they have generous retirement benefits, and you're an owner operator, you don't get that. So that's something you have to think about. The other thing about being an owner operator is that it takes a lot, a whole lot to be successful as an owner operator. You guys have nightmare stories about the expenses they have to pay. And you think about driving an old truck and then the engine blows. That's a $50,000 repair, and you end up having to walk away from that truck and go get another truck, even though you may have just done a $10,000 repair the month before. And it's like, it's kind of a risky business. It really is. There's a lot of risk in running those old trucks. You got a lot of money tied up in them old trucks, and if the engine blows, it's a big step backwards for sure. It's something that a truck, major truck repairs can break you. It really can. It can force guys into bankruptcy if they're not careful. If they don't save their money, they can't pay their bills, and they can't pay for truck repairs. Some guys are truly better off staying as company drivers. They can't handle being an owner operator, because you got to manage money. You got to be able to plan maintenance. You got to be able to figure things out. Troubleshoot your truck. There's a lot that goes into it, and a lot of company drivers, all they see is the dollar signs, right? They're like, oh, you guys making so much more money. I got to become an owner operator. What they don't see is all the hard work and heartache that goes into being an owner operator. And at times, it can make you really, question your own decision. Why did you ever buy a truck in the first place? So I think the guys who do well with owning their own trucks are the guys who thrive in that kind of environment. It's like, hey, it's tough, but that's what I want. I want it to be tough. If it was easy, I wouldn't want to do it. I expect it to be tough. I want it to be tough. I want it to be a challenge, and it's all that and more. And it's like, what aspects of being an owner operator, attracts you to that career choice. Because you could be a truck driver. I mean, millions of truck drivers. They're company drivers. Not so many are owner operators. And those who are, how many of those are actually successful? So if you're expecting, to buy a truck and everything to be, peaches and cream, it's probably not going to happen. You have unrealistic expectations. You would be better off expecting it to be extremely hard. And I will say money makes the world go round. So the more money you have, the easier it will be. Because money, you can buy newer equipment, better equipment. You can pay for truck repairs, things like that. You start out on a shoestring budget, it's going to be extremely, extremely hard. If you have good credit, you have credit available to you. You have business credit cards, and your credit score is over 800, and you have little to no debt. It's going to be manageable. It's going to be much more easy. You know, and I think too, the longer you become an owner operator, the easier it becomes. It's like anything else. It's hard at the beginning. It's very hard, but as the years go by, it becomes easier and easier with time because you're gaining experience, you're saving money, and you're gaining confidence and capability in your business model that you can handle almost anything that comes along. By the time you've been an owner operator for 10 years, it should be pretty smooth sailing after that. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.